I'm writing this from a Motel 6 off I-91 because I don't think I can explain this to the police without sounding insane. But I need to get it down. I need to document the timeline while the details are still sharp before the shock turns everything into a blur. My name is Elias, and for the last 7 years, I've worked as a freelance archivist specializing in estate liquidations. I'm the guy they call when a wealthy hoarder dies, and the next of kin needs to know if the junk in the attic is worth an auction or a bonfire. I've cataloged everything from Victorian medical equipment to taxidermied pets. I don't scare easily. Or at least, I didn't. 3 weeks ago, I accepted a contract from the estate of Arthur Holloway. If you know antique toys, you know the name. Holloway was a recluse, a genius craftsman who vanished from the public eye in the late 1980 seconds. He died of a stroke last month, leaving behind a sprawling Queen Anne property deep in the woods of central Vermont, about 40 minutes from the nearest paved road. The pay was $4,000 a week, plus a completion bonus. My job was specific: catalog the contents of the third-floor library. I arrived on November 4th. It was a Tuesday. The air up there tasted like wet pine and coming snow. The house itself was a monster of dark wood and peeling paint, sitting in a clearing that felt like it was being strangled by the forest. Inside, it smelled of cedar, camphor, and that distinct metallic scent of old dust. The library was massive, lined floor to ceiling with books I didn't care about. My focus was the centerpiece. It stood on a custom mahogany table in the center of the room, the Grand Opera House. It wasn't a toy, it was an architectural marvel. The structure was nearly 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, enclosed in a heavy, museum-grade glass case. It was a perfect 1/12 scale replica of a 1922 theater, complete with working velvet curtains, gold leaf molding, and a crystal chandelier that actually lit up. But the real draw was the audience. Holloway had populated the theater with exactly 200 hand-painted porcelain dolls. They were seated in the orchestra pit, the balconies, and the private boxes. I spent the first 4 hours just photographing them. The craftsmanship was unnerving. They didn't have the blank, dead stare of standard dolls. Holloway had painted them with micro-expressions: boredom, delight, gossip, judgment. Their eyes were made of glass, blown so skillfully they seemed to catch the light from every angle. It was 4:45 p.m. when I finished the initial count. The silence in that house was oppressive, heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I was zooming in on a photo I'd taken of the stage area when a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the temperature. It was that primal lizard brain instinct that tells you you're being watched. I looked up at the glass case. The theater was dark inside, the dolls just shadows in the fading daylight. It was majestic, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying. I packed up my gear, locking the library door behind me. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I told myself it was just a dollhouse. The first 2 days were monotonous. I cataloged the inventory numbers, assessed condition reports, and mapped the layout of the theater boxes. By Thursday morning, my third day in the house, the novelty of the Holloway estate had worn off, replaced by the crushing boredom of isolation. I woke up at 6:30 a.m. The house was freezing. The heating system, an ancient boiler in the basement, rattled the floorboards whenever it kicked on, sounding like a dying beast coughing through the vents. I made a pot of black coffee in the kitchen, staring out at the dense wall of pine trees that surrounded the property. It had snowed overnight, a light dusting that made the world outside look grayscale and dead. I took my mug up to the 3rd floor, unlocking the library with the heavy iron key. The air inside the room was stagnant. It felt thicker than the hallway air, smelling faintly of dried lavender and old paper. I sat down at my workstation, woke up my laptop, and looked over at the glass case. That was when I paused. It wasn't something obvious. It wasn't a doll's head spun around moment like in the movies. It was a spatial discrepancy, a subtle violation of geometry. I had spent 6 hours the previous day documenting the orchestra pit, the depressed section right in front of the stage, where 20 miniature musicians sat with their instruments. I knew that layout. I knew the spacing. To the naked eye, it looked crowded. Too crowded. I frowned, setting my coffee down. The steam curled up, obscuring the glass for a second. I walked over to the case, wiping the condensation away with my sleeve. The string section. The 4 violinists in the front row. They looked, pushed, I went back to my laptop and pulled up the high-resolution RAW files I'd shot yesterday at 4 p.m. I zoomed in on image IMG 442. In the photo, the lead violinist, a doll with a gray waistcoat and a stern, pinched face, was positioned clearly behind the miniature brass railing that separated the pit from the audience. There was a visible gap of mahogany floor between his chair and the rail, maybe half an inch of scale distance. I looked back at the case. The lead violinist's chair was now flush against the railing. The scroll of his tiny violin was actually poking over the brass bar. My stomach gave a weird little lurch. Not fear, exactly. Just a sudden drop in temperature. I toggled back and forth between the photo and the live view. "Okay," I whispered. My voice sounded too loud in the empty room. I stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize it. The house was old. The floorboards were warped. When the furnace kicked on, the whole room vibrated. I'd felt it through the soles of my boots. It was basic physics. Vibrations travel through wood. Objects migrate. It happens on washing machines. It happens in old houses. I convinced myself. I really did. I told myself that tonight I'd put a shim under the table leg to stabilize it. But as I turned back to my computer, I couldn't help but notice the direction they had moved. They hadn't shifted randomly, like coins rattling on a dryer. They had all moved forward, toward the stage. I needed control. That's how I deal with stress. I organize, I measure, I quantify. If the house was vibrating the dolls out of position, I was going to prove it with data. Then, I could shim the table legs, finish the job, and get the hell out of Vermont. I went out to my truck and grabbed my Bosch GLM 50 laser measure. It's a tool I usually use for sizing up rooms for storage units, accurate to within 1.5 millimeters. Back in the library, I approached the case. I decided to focus on the conductor. He was the most prominent figure, standing on a raised podium in the center of the pit, back turned to the audience, baton raised high. He was wearing a black tuxedo with tails, and his painted face was frozen in a moment of intense, screaming passion. His mouth was an open O, his eyebrows drawn together. I placed the base of the laser measure against the interior glass pane, aiming the red dot directly at the center of the conductor's back. Click. 243 millimeters. I wrote it down on a yellow sticky note. November 6, 10:15 a.m. Conductor to glass. 243 millimeters. I stuck the note directly onto the outside of the glass, right at eye level. "Don't move," I muttered. I felt ridiculous talking to a piece of fired clay, but the silence in the room was making me jittery. I locked the library door again, double-checking the handle, and went down the hall to the guest bedroom I was using as a temporary office. I had a stack of provenance papers to scan, and I wanted to be away from those staring glass eyes for a while. The guest room was about 40 feet down the corridor. I left the door open so I could hear if the furnace kicked on again, wanting to correlate any vibrations with movement. I worked for about an hour. It was quiet. Not the quiet of a city apartment, where you still hear the hum of traffic or the buzz of a fridge. This was deep, rural silence, the kind that rings in your ears. It was 11:27 a.m. when I heard it. I froze, my hand hovering over the scanner. It was a sound coming from the hallway. Faint, rhythmic, scritch, pause, scritch, pause. My first thought was mice. The house was old, it made sense, but the quality of the sound was wrong. It didn't sound like claws on wood. It sounded harder, glassier. It sounded like a ceramic plate being dragged slowly across a wooden table. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the direction of the library. It wasn't continuous. It was stop and start, like something heavy was being pulled, inch by inch. Scritch. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The noise down the hall stopped instantly. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just the settling of the house and the wind pushing against the siding. I walked into the hallway, my socks sliding on the hardwood. The library door was still locked. The heavy oak panels looked solid, immovable. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. I waited there for a full minute, my heart hammering a weird rhythm against my ribs. I told myself it was the pipes. It was the wind. It was literally anything other than what my gut was screaming at me. I didn't open the door. I wasn't ready to check the measurement yet. I went back to the office, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and blasted a podcast. I drowned it out. That was my mistake. I should have checked then. I slept with the lights on that night. I told myself it was to read through the case files, but I knew I was lying. Every time the house settled, I flinched. The next morning, November 7th, I delayed going into the library until 9:30 a.m. The sun was out, bright and blinding against the snow, which gave me a false sense of security. Daylight burns away ghosts, right? That's the rule. I unlocked the library door. The air inside was freezing colder than the hallway. I could see my breath pluming in front of me as I walked toward the table. The yellow sticky note was still there on the glass. No fed, 6:10:15 a.m. Conductor to glass, 243 millimeters. I didn't look at the dolls immediately. I kept my eyes on the floor, focusing on my boots, on the pattern of the Persian rug. I raised the Bosch laser measure, pressed it against the glass right next to the sticky note, and hit the button. The red laser dot shot through the glass. It didn't hit the conductor's back. It hit the velvet curtain behind him. My heart hammered a hard, singular thud against my ribs. I looked up. The conductor wasn't on the podium. He had moved 3 inches to the left. He was no longer facing the orchestra. He had rotated 90 degrees on his base. He was now facing the stage left wall, where a small painted door marked exit in gold leaf was situated. His baton, which had been raised high in a conducting motion yesterday, was now lowered. It was pointing directly at that door. "No," I whispered. The word felt dry in my mouth, like I'd been eating ash. No way. I took a reading on his new position. The distance was completely different. But it wasn't just him. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. I looked up at the balconies, the private boxes on the second tier of the miniature theater. In yesterday's photos, I knew this for a fact. I had stared at them for hours. The wealthy patrons in the boxes were facing the stage center, watching the performance. Now, every single head in the left side balcony was turned. They weren't looking at the stage, they were looking at the conductor. It was a subtle rotation, maybe 30 degrees, but the effect was undeniable. It looked like a crowd watching a leader. I felt a wave of dizziness hit me. The rational part of my brain, the part that dealt in dimensions and inventory lists, was trying to short circuit. Vibrations don't rotate heads, it screamed. Vibrations don't make a doll step down from a podium and point at a door. I leaned in closer, my nose almost touching the cold glass. I needed to see the conductor's face. I needed to see if the expression had changed. That's when I saw the dust. On the polished mahogany floor of the miniature stage, right behind the conductor's current position, there were drag marks in the thin layer of dust. 2 parallel lines. He hadn't been vibrated. He had walked, or he had been dragged. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and hit the bookshelf behind me. A few heavy volumes thudded to the floor, but I didn't look at them. I couldn't take my eyes off the case. The silence in the room was suddenly deafening. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt crowded. I needed control. That's how I deal with stress. I organize, I measure, I quantify. If the house was vibrating the dolls out of position, I was going to prove it with data. Then I could shim the table legs, finish the job, and get the hell out of Vermont. I went out to my truck and grabbed my Bosch GLM50 laser measure. It's a tool I usually use for sizing up rooms for storage units, accurate to within 1.5 millimeters. Back in the library, I approached the case. I decided to focus on the conductor. He was the most prominent figure, standing on a raised podium in the center of the pit, back turned to the audience, baton raised high. He was wearing a black tuxedo with tails, and his painted face was frozen in a moment of intense, screaming passion. His mouth was an open O, his eyebrows drawn together. I placed the base of the laser measure against the interior glass pane, aiming the red dot directly at the center of the conductor's back. Click. 243 millimeters. I wrote it down on a yellow sticky note. Nov 6:10:15 a.m. Conductor to glass. 243 millimeters. I stuck the note directly onto the outside of the glass, right at eye level. "Don't move," I muttered. It felt ridiculous talking to a piece of fired clay, but the silence in the room was making me jittery. I locked the library door again, double-checking the handle, and went down the hall to the guest bedroom I was using as a temporary office. I had a stack of Provenance papers to scan, and I wanted to be away from those staring glass eyes for a while. The guest room was about 40 feet down the corridor. I left the door open so I could hear if the furnace kicked on again, wanting to correlate any vibrations with movement. I worked for about an hour. It was quiet. Not the quiet of a city apartment where you still hear the hum of traffic or the buzz of a fridge. This was deep, rural silence, the kind that rings in your ears. It was 11:27 a.m. when I heard it. I froze, my hand hovering over the scanner. It was a sound coming from the hallway. Faint, rhythmic, scritch, pause, scritch, pause. My first thought was mice. The house was old, it made sense. But the quality of the sound was wrong. It didn't sound like claws on wood. It sounded harder, glassier. It sounded like a ceramic plate being dragged slowly across a wooden table. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the direction of the library. It wasn't continuous. It was stop and start, like something heavy was being pulled, inch by inch. Scritch. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The noise down the hall stopped instantly. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just the settling of the house and the wind pushing against the siding. I walked into the hallway, my socks sliding on the hardwood. The library door was still locked. The heavy oak panels looked solid, immovable. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. I waited there for a full minute, my heart hammering a weird rhythm against my ribs. I told myself it was the pipes. It was the wind. It was literally anything other than what my gut was screaming at me. I didn't open the door. I wasn't ready to check the measurement yet. I went back to the office, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and blasted a podcast. I drowned it out. That was my mistake. I should have checked then. I slept with the lights on that night. I told myself it was to read through the case files, but I knew I was lying. Every time the house settled, I flinched. The next morning, November 7th, I delayed going into the library until 9:30 a.m. The sun was out, bright and blinding against the snow, which gave me a false sense of security. Daylight burns away ghosts, right? That's the rule. I unlocked the library door. The air inside was freezing colder than the hallway. I could see my breath pluming in front of me as I walked toward the table. The yellow sticky note was still there on the glass. Noven 6:10:15 a.m. Conductor to glass, 243 millimeters. I didn't look at the dolls immediately. I kept my eyes on the floor, focusing on my boots, on the pattern of the Persian rug. I raised the Bosch laser measure, pressed it against the glass right next to the sticky note, and hit the button. The red laser dot shot through the glass. It didn't hit the conductor's back. It hit the velvet curtain behind him. My heart hammered a hard, singular thud against my ribs. I looked up. The conductor wasn't on the podium. He had moved 3 inches to the left. He was no longer facing the orchestra. He had rotated 90 degrees on his base. He was now facing the stage left wall, where a small painted door marked exit in gold leaf was situated. His baton, which had been raised high in a conducting motion yesterday, was now lowered. It was pointing directly at that door. "No," I whispered. The word fell dry in my mouth, like I'd been eating ash. No way. I took a reading on his new position. The distance was completely different, but it wasn't just him. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. I looked up at the balconies, the private boxes on the second tier of the miniature theater. In yesterday's photos, I knew this for a fact. I had stared at them for hours. The wealthy patrons in the boxes were facing the stage center, watching the performance. Now, every single head in the left side balcony was turned. They weren't looking at the stage. They were looking at the conductor. It was a subtle rotation, maybe 30 degrees, but the effect was undeniable. It looked like a crowd watching a leader. I felt a wave of dizziness hit me. The rational part of my brain, the part that dealt in dimensions and inventory lists, was trying to short circuit. "Vibrations don't rotate heads," it screamed. "Vibrations don't make a doll step down from a podium and point at a door." I leaned in closer, my nose almost touching the cold glass. I needed to see the conductor's face. I needed to see if the expression had changed. That's when I saw the dust. On the polished mahogany floor of the miniature stage, right behind the conductor's current position, there were drag marks in the thin layer of dust. 2 parallel lines. He hadn't been vibrated. He had walked, or he had been dragged. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and hit the bookshelf behind me. A few heavy volumes thudded to the floor, but I didn't look at them. I couldn't take my eyes off the case. The silence in the room was suddenly deafening. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt crowded. I should have left. Any sane person would have packed their bags and driven until the gas tank ran dry. But fear is a funny thing. It paralyzes you, but it also makes you obsessive. I needed to know how. My brain refused to accept magic. I needed a mechanism. I went to my kit and dug out my jeweler's loupe, a 10x magnification lens I use for inspecting hallmarks on silver or signatures on paintings. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get the loupe to my eye. I leaned in toward the glass, focusing on the conductor first. Under the lens, the world of the miniature theater became a landscape of terrifying texture. I could see the brushstrokes in the conductor's coat, the tiny flecks of dust caught in the varnish. I focused on his face. In the catalog, photos from Tuesday, the conductor's expression had been one of artistic passion, eyes wide, mouth open in a shout, a caricature of a maestro. Through the loupe, that passion was gone. His face was contorted. The pain around his eyes seemed to have thinned, stretched by some impossible internal pressure. His mouth wasn't shouting a note anymore, it was grimacing. The corners of his lips were pulled back tight, exposing tiny, painted teeth that looked like they were grinding together. It wasn't art, it was exertion. He looked like a man trying to push a boulder up a hill. I moved the loupe to the front row of the orchestra. The violinists. The one I had seen poking over the rail, his face was slick. I blinked, wiping the lens, thinking it was a smudge. It wasn't. The porcelain on his forehead was glistening. It looked like sweat. I pulled back, gasping for air. The humidity in the room hadn't changed, but I felt like I was drowning. "This isn't real," I said aloud. "Paint doesn't sweat. Porcelain doesn't grimace." But then I looked at where the conductor was pointing. His baton was aimed directly at the stage left wall, at that painted exit door. I hadn't paid much attention to the structure of the case itself, before only the contents. But now, following the line of the baton, I saw it. The exit door wasn't just painted on the set wall. It was positioned exactly 3 inches from the corner of the glass enclosure. I moved the loupe to the glass pane itself, right where the miniature door pointed. There was a flaw. It was a hairline fracture, barely visible to the naked eye, running about 4 inches vertically up the glass. It looked like a stress fracture, but looking closely, the edges of the crack weren't smooth. They were chipped from the inside. Tiny, microscopic flakes of glass were resting on the floor of the case. Something wasn't just pressing against the glass, they were chipping away at it. The conductor wasn't leading an orchestra. He was coordinating a prison break. I didn't want to be in the room when the sun went down. The thought of standing in the dark with 200 pairs of glass eyes watching me was enough to make me vomit. But I needed to know what was happening during those lost hours. I went to my gear bag and pulled out my Zoom H5 handy recorder. It's a field recorder I use for oral history interviews. It picks up everything: the hum of a fridge 2 rooms away, the heartbeat of a nervous interviewee. I mounted it on a small tripod about 6 inches from the glass case, pointing the XY microphones directly at the fracture near the exit door. I hit record, checked the levels, and got the hell out of there. I spent the night in the living room on the 1st floor, as far away from the library as possible. I dragged the heavy leather sofa in front of the door. I barely slept. Every time the house groaned, I gripped the tire iron I'd brought in from my truck. Morning came slowly, gray and heavy. November 8th. I went up at 8 a.m. to retrieve the recorder. I didn't look at the case. I kept my eyes strictly on the device. I grabbed it, stopped the recording, and ran back to my makeshift office. I popped the SD card into my laptop and put on my noise-canceling headphones. The file was 8 hours long. The waveform display was mostly a flat line, just the ambient noise of the empty room. I scrubbed forward, speeding through the silence. At the 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 33 seconds mark, the flat line spiked. I pressed play. At first, it sounded like static, a low, dry rustling. I turned the volume up. It wasn't static, it was friction. It sounded like hundreds of stones being rubbed together. Click, clack, scrape. It was the sound of stiff, articulated joints moving. Then came the footsteps. It wasn't the heavy thud of human feet. It was a chaotic, high-pitched tapping, like rain hitting a tin roof, but heavier, harder. Tap, 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 tap. Then, a sound that made me rip the headphones off my ears. A high-pitched, resonant squeal. It was the sound of fired clay grinding against fired clay. Unglazed porcelain rubbing together. It was a sound of immense friction, of things forcing themselves to move in ways they weren't designed to. I forced the headphones back on. I had to listen. Underneath the movement, there was a rhythm. It wasn't random. The tapping would surge, then stop. Surge, then stop. Heave. Pause. Heave. Pause. They were working. At 4:03 a.m. on the recording, there was a different sound. A sharp, rhythmic tink, tink, tink. It sounded like metal hitting glass. Or maybe hard ceramic hitting glass. They weren't just moving toward the exit. They were hammering at it. I stared at the waveform on my screen. The noise continued for 3 solid hours, only stopping when the first light of dawn would have hit the library windows. I sat there in the silence of the guest room. The recording paused. My hands were sweating so much they were slick on the mouse. I knew I had to go back in there. I had to see what they had done. The walk down the hallway to the library felt like walking to the gallows. The floorboards seemed to whine under my boots, a low moan that echoed in the emptiness of the house. I had the tire iron in my back pocket. It felt heavy, useless. Against what? Tiny porcelain men? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, but the fear was real. It was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I unlocked the library door. The first thing I noticed was the draft. The room was freezing, significantly colder than the hallway. I looked toward the window. It was shut tight. Then I looked at the case. The fracture I had seen yesterday, the hairline crack near the exit door, it wasn't a hairline anymore. A triangular shard of glass, maybe 2 inches wide at the base, had been punched out. It lay on the mahogany table, glittering in the weak morning light like a jagged tooth. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on something. I froze. I looked down. There, on the Persian rug, about 5 feet away from the table, lay a violin. It was tiny. Perfect. The wood was varnished, the strings made of hair-thin wire. My eyes followed the trajectory. From the table leg, across the rug, to the door. 10 feet away from the violin, near the threshold of the library door, was the violinist. He was lying on his side. His gray waistcoat was dusted with lint from the carpet. His face, that pinched, stern face I had studied in the photos, was turned toward the hallway. He wasn't broken. He looked discarded. Or maybe he was the scout. I felt a wave of nausea. I knelt down, reaching out to touch him. I expected him to be cold, like any inanimate object in a freezing room. I touched the porcelain hand. It was warm. Not hot, but warm. Like a stone that had been held in a palm. It held a residual heat. I snatched my hand back, scrambling backwards until my back hit the doorframe. Jesus, I hissed. I stood up and looked back at the case. The orchestra pit was in chaos. Chairs were overturned. Music stands were knocked flat. The orderly rows I had cataloged were gone. It looked like a riot had broken out. But the conductor? He was still there. He hadn't escaped yet. He was standing right at the edge of the glass breach. His back was to me. He was facing the hole, his baton lowered, looking out into the room. It looked for all the world like he was guarding the exit. I grabbed the violinist off the floor. He felt heavy, denser than he should be. I didn't want to touch him, but I couldn't leave him there. I walked back to the case, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and shoved him through the hole in the glass. He clattered onto the wooden floor of the stage, landing in a heap. I grabbed a roll of heavy-duty packing tape from my bag and slapped it over the hole, layer after layer. I taped it until the glass was a thick, opaque brick of adhesive. "Stay in there," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just stay in there." I turned to leave, grabbing my bag. As I reached for the door handle, I heard it. A sound from inside the case. Thump. Soft. Deliberate. Against the glass I had just taped. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran to the kitchen, my boots sliding on the linoleum. I grabbed the wall-mounted landline, a beige relic from the 90s, and jammed the receiver to my ear. Silence. Not even the crackle of static, just the dead, hollow weight of a disconnected line. I pulled out my cell phone. Searching. Then, no service. It was expected the reception in this valley was garbage on a sunny day, but now, with the sky turning a bruised purple and the wind howling like a wounded animal, it felt like a death sentence. Outside, the weather had turned violent. A nor'easter, the radio had said earlier. The snow was coming down in sheets, thick and heavy, blurring the tree line into a wall of gray. My truck was out there, but the driveway was a quarter mile of steep, unplowed gravel. If I tried to drive down in this, I'd slide right off into the ravine. I was trapped. I paced the kitchen, gripping the tire iron until my hand cramped. It's just pressure, I tried to tell myself. Thermal expansion inside the case caused the glass to crack. The vibration moved the dolls. But I couldn't convince myself. I knew what I had felt. That doll was warm. Then I heard it. It wasn't a scratch this time. It was a crash. It came from the 3rd floor. The sound of something heavy toppling over. I froze. Hello? I screamed at the ceiling. Is someone there? Only the wind answered, rattling the window frames. I had to go back up. I couldn't just sit in the kitchen waiting for them to come down. I needed to know if the tape had held. I needed to see what was happening. I took the stairs 2 at a time, the tire iron raised. The hallway was dim, shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor. The library door was open, just as I had left it. I stopped in the doorway. The first thing I saw was the chandelier inside the dollhouse. It was flickering. On, off, like Morse code. Then I saw the conductor. He wasn't by the taped-up hole anymore. He had moved to the front pane of the glass, the one facing the door, the one facing me. He was pressed right up against it. His tiny porcelain hands were splayed out on the glass at shoulder height, palms flat. His face, that horrible, grimacing face, was mashed against the clear surface. The pressure was so intense I could see the distortion of his painted features. But it was his eyes. In every photo, the conductor looked straight ahead. Now, his eyes were rolled up and to the right. He was looking directly at the doorway, directly at my face. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, the darkness of the miniature theater seemed to be shifting. I saw movement in the shadows of the orchestra pit. A violin bow rising and falling, not in music, but in a rhythmic stabbing motion. The conductor's jaw, which had been painted in an open shout, seemed wider now. As I watched, paralyzed by a terror so deep it felt like ice in my veins, I saw his jaw move. It dropped a fraction of a millimeter, a tiny stiff hinge giving way. He was screaming. I couldn't hear it through the glass, but I saw the vibration, a high-frequency tremor that made the glass pane hum. He wasn't trying to get out of the theater anymore. He was trying to get at me. I slammed the library door and threw the bolt. Then I dragged a heavy oak console table from the hallway and shoved it against the frame. It was a pointless gesture. The door opened inward, but I needed to do something. I retreated to the study on the 2nd floor. It was smaller, defendable. It had a solid door and a window that opened onto a porch roof. If I had to jump, I could. I barricaded myself in at 4:30 p.m. The storm outside had killed the daylight early, plunging the house into a premature, suffocating twilight. I sat in the corner, facing the door, a flashlight in one hand and the tire iron in the other. I listened. For the first hour, there was only the wind. Then, at 6:15 p.m., it started. Thump. It was coming from the ceiling, directly above me. The library floor. Thump. 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 It sounded like fists. Hundreds of tiny, hard fists hammering against the floorboards. It wasn't the chaotic scuttling I had heard on the recording. This was synchronized. Boom. The sound changed. It was heavier now. They were dropping something. Books? The table itself? Then came the sound that broke me. It was a sound of splintering wood. Not the library floor, the library door. I heard the distinct crack of the door frame giving way upstairs. Then the heavy thud of the console table being pushed aside. They were out. I heard them in the hallway above. The sound was like a tide of marbles rolling across hardwood. A flowing, clicking, clattering mass. They reached the stairs. Click-clack. Click-clack. The sound of porcelain feet on wooden steps. But it wasn't one or two. It sounded like a waterfall of ceramics pouring down the staircase. I held my breath, tears streaming down my face. "Go away," I whispered, my voice barely a squeak. "Please, just go away." They didn't stop. They reached the 2nd floor landing. The noise stopped. Total silence. I stared at the gap under the study door. The hallway light was off, so it was just a line of darkness. Then, a shadow broke the line. Something small, 2 tiny feet, then another pair, and another. The gap filled up with shadows. They were standing right outside. Then, a sound so soft I almost missed it. Scratch. Something was scratching at the bottom of the door. Scratch. Scratch. It moved up. They were climbing. I heard the tiny clicks of porcelain hands finding purchase on the wood, the faint scrape of their bodies dragging upward. They were climbing toward the handle. I watched the brass doorknob turn. It didn't move smoothly. It moved in jagged, ratchet-like increments. Click. 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 It was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. Not a monster kicking down the door, but the knowledge that something small, something that shouldn't have the strength to turn a latch, was working together to do it. The bolt slid back. The door creaked open. Just an inch. Then, the house died. The power cut out instantly. No flicker, no warning. Just absolute, suffocating darkness. The storm must have finally taken down the main line. The silence of the electronics dying, the hum of the printer, the buzz of the heater was replaced by the sound of the wind screaming outside, and that wet, clicking noise from the hallway. I scrambled backward, knocking over a chair. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I thumbed the side button, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness like a knife. I aimed it at the door. The door was wide open now, and the floor was moving. It looked like a carpet of mold spreading in fast forward. A sea of faded velvet, gray wool, and white porcelain was spilling into the room. There were hundreds of them. The musicians, the audience members in their finery, the ushers. They didn't walk like humans. They moved with a horrific, insect-like scuttle. They were on all fours, limbs splayed out at unnatural angles, dragging their stiff bodies forward with a speed that defied physics. Click, clack, scrape, hiss. I swung the light wildly. They were climbing the doorframe. They were crawling up the curtains. They were swarming over the bookshelf. In the center of the mass, riding on the shoulders of 4 crushed violinists like a grotesque king on a palanquin, was the conductor. The light caught his face. He was staring right at me. His baton was gone. In his hand, he held a long, jagged shard of glass from the display case. It looked like a crystal sword. He raised it. The swarm stopped. Every single head in the room, 200 pairs of glass eyes snapped toward me. The sound was a singular, sharp clack. The conductor's mouth, that hinged, broken jaw, dropped open again. He brought the glass shard down. The floor erupted. They surged forward, a tidal wave of hard ceramic and hate. I heard the sound of them jumping, their bodies hitting the floorboards, the furniture, my legs. It wasn't an attack, it was a consumption. I kicked out, my boot connecting with a cluster of them. I heard the sickening crunch of hollow porcelain shattering. Dust puffed up in the flashlight beam, but they didn't stop. The broken ones just kept crawling, dragging their jagged, shattered torsos toward me with their hands. They were swarming up my jeans. I felt tiny, hard fingers digging into the denim, pinching my skin. They were heavy, so much heavier than they should be. I swung the tire iron, smashing it into the mass on the floor, pulverizing a lady in a blue dress. But 3 more took her place. They were climbing the chair I had just vacated. They were on the desk. They were trying to get high ground. They were trying to reach my face. I didn't think. I reacted. It was a primal, animalistic surge of adrenaline that drowned out the terror just enough to get my legs moving. I looked down at my left thigh. A doll in a green velvet coat. One of the balcony patrons had clamped its tiny porcelain arms around my leg. I saw it raise a fist. The hand was broken off at the wrist, leaving a jagged spear of ceramic. It brought the stump down hard, tearing through my denim jeans and sinking into the muscle. I screamed a raw, guttural sound that hurt my throat. I smashed the tire iron down on its head. The skull exploded in a puff of white dust and shards. "Get off!" I roared, kicking wildly. I couldn't stay in the corner. If I stayed, they would bury me. I had to get to the front door. I had to cross the sea of them. I charged. I ran directly into the swarm. It was the most nauseating physical sensation of my life. Every step was a crunch. I felt their hollow bodies collapsing under my boots. The snapping of delicate limbs, the shattering of painted faces. It felt like running through a pile of dry bones. Crunch, snap, crunch. I slipped on the debris, my boots sliding on a crushed torso. I flailed, my hand hitting the wall to steady myself. Immediately, I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my palm. I pulled it back. 2 of them were hanging off my hand, their fingers dug into my skin. I shook my hand violently, slinging them into the far wall. They shattered on impact, but I didn't stop to look. I reached the hallway. It was a gauntlet. They were pouring out of the library, dropping from the banister like hail. I reached the stairs and didn't bother with the steps. I jumped. I cleared the first flight in a reckless leap, landing hard on the landing. My ankle twisted, sending a bolt of fire up my leg, but I kept moving. Behind me, the sound was deafening. It sounded like a landslide of gravel chasing me down the stairs. Click, clack, crash. I hit the foyer floor, slipping on the hardwood. I scrambled on all fours for a second, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. The front door. It was 20 feet away. Between me and the door, the conductor was waiting. He must have fallen or jumped from the second floor. He was standing on the entryway rug, his tuxedo torn, one arm missing entirely, but he was standing. He looked at me. Then, he looked at the deadbolt. He started running toward the door. He wasn't trying to block me. He was trying to lock it. "No!" I shrieked. I lunged forward, swinging the tire iron like a golf club. I connected. The iron bar hit the conductor mid-stride. There was no resistance. He didn't just break, he disintegrated. His torso vaporized into a cloud of white powder and ceramic shrapnel. I slammed my body against the heavy oak door, fumbling with the deadbolt. My fingers were slick with blood and sweat. Clack! The lock turned. I threw the door open and fell out into the snow. The wind hit me like a physical blow, freezing the sweat on my face instantly. I scrambled up, running blindly toward where I'd parked the truck. The snow was up to my shins. I didn't have a coat. I didn't care. I reached the truck, ripping the door open. I dove inside and slammed it shut, locking it instantly. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, and roared to life. I threw the headlights on. The front steps of the house were illuminated in the twin beams of light. They were there, hundreds of them. They were spilling out of the open front door, tumbling down the snowy steps, a wave of color against the white snow. They were crawling toward the tires. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the ice, then catching gravel. I spun the wheel and floored it, fishtailing down the driveway, leaving the nightmare behind in the rearview mirror. It's been 6 months since I drove away from the Holloway estate. I wrote the first part of this account in a motel room that night, shaking so hard I could barely type. I haven't looked at the document until today. I live in Boston now. I chose the city on purpose. I wanted noise. I wanted sirens, traffic, drunk college kids shouting at 3 a.m. I wanted anything that would drown out the memory of that dry, clicking sound. I rent a 4th floor walk-up in a brick building. I figured the height was a safety feature. I was wrong. The doctors dug 3 fragments of painted porcelain out of my left thigh. The wound got infected. Badly. They told me it was just debris, but the infection spread in a pattern that looked like a spider web, or a crack in glass. It aches when it rains. It aches when the house is too quiet. I thought I was safe here. I thought distance mattered. 3 days ago, I came home from work and found a trail of dust in my kitchen. It wasn't normal dust. It was white, fine, and gritty. It looked like bone meal. It led from the front door vent to the refrigerator. I swept it up, telling myself it was construction work from the unit upstairs. I checked the locks. I put a chair under the doorknob. Last night, I woke up at 2:47 a.m. The city outside was quiet, but there was a sound coming from the window. The window that opens onto the fire escape. Tink, tink, tink. Metal hitting glass. I didn't turn on the light. I crawled out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat I keep next to my nightstand. I crept to the window and peered through the blinds. The fire escape was empty. The iron grating was bare. But on the windowsill, on the outside, there was something small. It was a black velvet case, about 3 inches long. I recognized it instantly. It was the case for the miniature cello from the second row of the orchestra pit. I didn't open the window. I backed away, grabbed my keys, and I left. I'm currently sitting in an internet cafe, uploading this. I'm not going back to the apartment. I'm not going to pack. I'm just going to drive. But I don't think it matters. As I was typing this, I heard a sound from the ventilation duct above my head. It's a busy cafe, lots of noise, coffee grinders, music, but I heard it. Scritch. Pause. Scritch. They aren't haunting the house, and they aren't haunting the dollhouse. They are haunting the audience. And I'm the only one left who saw the show. If you ever see a Victorian dollhouse at an estate sale, specifically one with a full orchestra, do not look at the conductor. Do not measure the distance to the exit. And for the love of God, do not let them see you watching. The show is over, but the musicians are still playing. And they are getting closer.